Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt ZAUN. Thank you for joining us as we uncover how stories are one of the most important aspects of your business. We'll talk about struggles, victories, and how you can utilize strategic storytelling to inspire those around you to action. Enjoy this episode. Today, more than ever, it feels like people are more frustrated, stressed out, and burned out than they have ever been. And there's different things that we can do to help with that. And that's why I'm excited to dive into today's conversation, because today I'm joined by KIANNA Sage, who is an energy psychology specialist at InSync Consulting. Welcome to the show, KIANNA.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Yeah. And I appreciate everything that you do. And for the last several months, we've been connected on LinkedIn. I've seen a lot of your content. You've actually shared with me things that have changed my perspective. One of them being me trying to focus too much on having a work-life balance, and you actually talking about harmony and the differences in that. And I think that's really important, because I feel like with me, the work-life balance that I was trying to pursue, I felt like I never could achieve it. And then when I focused on actually the elements of harmony, being present in the moment, having that harmony, there was a major mind shift just based on some of the things that you said. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Well, I have the chills. I'm so pleased that my comment on a thread could have that impact on you and others, because I think oftentimes we don't think we're having an impact, right? All of us, even as leaders, and to know that our words matter is huge. Sure.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate that. I want to dive in and talk about that for a moment, just to expand on that, because I feel like a lot of people talk about work-life balance. I feel like it became a buzz phrase in the corporate arena for quite some time. But as you know, there are times that we need to focus on a project, and there's times we need to be more mindful and focus on family. And there's a time, so there is a difference based on what you shared with me a while ago. There's a difference between trying to obtain a work-life balance and truly focusing on harmony. So can you paint the picture for people on what it truly means to focus on harmony?
Well, I think in my work, I use what I call the circle of becoming, and we're always in a state of becoming, right? We don't ever stay stuck. Even though we might have a perception of being stuck, we're not stuck. So as we are becoming, there needs to be clarity in where we're going. And if we don't have that clarity, like work-life balance, if we think our life is really distinctly separate with work life, that in and of itself is kind of a problem, because we're not split like that. We're not fractured. However, our thinking might be. And so our thinking then propels this divide and fragmentation within ourselves and causes a lot of inner conflict that's difficult to resolve. If and you can't find harmony when you're in inner conflict. And let's be honest, if you're a parent and a CEO, you don't get to turn those hats off. You're always a parent. You're always a CEO. So there's no division there. That's part of the hat that you wear all the time. The difference then becomes, how do you begin to incorporate those aspects of yourself so you don't see yourself as separate? Because that's where the problems come in.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I feel like a lot of people do that. They focus on being separate. And one of the things that I feel that was a huge cultural change that was really sped up through COVID was, if everyone that's listening, I'm sure you can recall, in 2020, there were multiple months where people didn't even know what day of the week it was, let alone were they doing personal time or were they doing business activities, right? Because things were they were so mixed in and so mingled. And I feel like things are so separate in people's minds. And I feel like that's an old way of thinking. At least it's an old cultural way. I remember when I was being raised, I feel like the worlds were very separate because my parents, they focused on different elements of business, and then their personal life was separate from business, and that was a cultural norm back then. And today it's so intermingled that people are still trying to live in that old way of thinking. So what would you say to someone that is saying, I'm a parent at this moment, I'm a business leader at this moment, I'm focused on spiritual growth at this moment, I'm focused on my health at this moment? Because I feel like we're constantly separating things. I mean, people write their goals a lot of times based on different categories. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say it's time to expand to a new paradigm, a new way of being that allows you to, number one, enjoy life. If you're a CEO or senior executive and you are not enjoying your job, it is going to be difficult to compel those others to follow you. So how are you able to integrate your passions, your joy into everything that you're doing? And I'm so glad that you brought up goals, because I think that goals have become a focus area, but they don't bring you clarity. And clarity is what propels motion. And I think those distinctions need to be made. And to be fragmented within these inner conflicts. And I think what you're saying really is that people have a lot of inner conflicts, and those inner conflicts show up always in the outer world. So the inner world always reflects in the outer world. So if you're seeing a lot of conflicts, and, I used to have as my title conflict management expert, and gosh, did I have conflict everywhere. And I really relished it because I'm good at conflict. I worked with the military for a long time because I'm really good at bringing conflict in and using it as a tool to elevate and get momentum. However, you get it everywhere in your life. And if you have a lot of inner conflicts, so that's going to show up in your life. So if you're seeing something you do not like, you do not enjoy, like you seeing that you're not in harmony or congruent, the best thing to do is to take time to reflect. You must be able to see what is happening on a regular basis in order to make any distinction in progress towards going somewhere that has some resolution. Because inner conflicts, for me, they can be resolved very quickly through what I do, which is energy psychology. However, it's very difficult for people to even acknowledge that they have inner conflict because we've been conditioned to pretend that things are okay, and that's a problem.
Interesting. All right. So you gave us a lot to unpack here. So there's so much there's so many directions we could take this, a lot to unpack. So you say clarity is what propels motion. And then you talked about goals and how oftentimes people's goals aren't really aligned with what they want to achieve. There's one of the things that comes to my mind as you're saying this is I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Jude Sullivan back in January, and we were talking about fitness, about losing weight, right? Because a lot of people are mindful of losing weight around January. And one of the things that he had said to me, which was a complete game changer, it literally changed my goal, so to speak, because I was so focused on weight loss. And he said, why don't you focus more on your health than weight loss? Because the picture I had in my mind was a certain number on the scale. And he had talked about, with me focusing more on my health, like truly being aligned with my health, that it would just come. And I did that. So I literally changed my goal of, I'm going to fit in a certain pant size, I'm going to hit a certain number on the scale, to just focusing, being in harmony with my health. And I dropped more weight than I thought possible. I'm more energetic than I've ever been. Like I'm getting older and I'm getting more energetic based on what Jude had said. So that's what screamed out to me when you were saying this, because oftentimes I feel like the most important stories that we tell are the ones we tell ourselves. And the story that I was telling myself was, I'm not achieving my goals with weight loss. I don't have the body I once did. And I was a very competitive athlete from middle school all the way through college. And I kept telling myself, I'm on this roller coaster up, down, and it was frustrating. And it wasn't until Jude like completely changed my alignment with focus on your health. So is that along the same lines of what you're talking about regarding getting clarity?
Well, I think what you just gave a beautiful example of is a paradigm shift, right?
Okay, paradigm shift.
Focusing on the numbers is old paradigm. It's the old way, the SMART goals. That's the way we were taught and conditioned as executive, is to make a SMART goal and then, go after it. And what the new paradigm is clarity is really about being centered, grounded, and self-assured in the direction that you're going, which is different than focused on losing weight and a goal. One makes you feel better, and the other one makes you feel pressured. And so that's often what's happening with goals, is that people make these personal goals that are pressured, and then it stresses them. But when we are overstressed, my post today is going to be about post-traumatic stress disorder. When we are overstressed and we put more pressure on our systems, our nervous system, it's difficult for us to gain the clarity and to be grounded and assured in the direction that we're going. So the distinction in where you are focusing, I would say, focus on what makes you feel better. And because how you feel determines how fast you will go. Pressure often slows people down for many reasons, because there's a physiological thing that happens in our body. But we're not professional athletes. We're CEOs, we're executives. We're not supposed to be a Michael Jordan and putting that kind of pressure on ourselves. That's not the game. We're in the marathon, not a 90-minute game.
So, no, what you're saying is invaluable. It was interesting to me to hear you talk about SMART goals and the way you did. So can you just expand on that? Because in corporate America, people are taught all the time about SMART goals. So what's the difference between focusing on SMART goals and focusing on those different shifts that you had talked about?
Well, so when I have my clients have goals as well, and oftentimes, like if you're in sales, they get shoved at you, right? Here's your goal. And often the executives feel, even I have worked with somebody in retail, a very high-end retail, their numbers are shoved at them and go make it happen. And the first time this client came to me, they were so overwhelmed by the number that they couldn't even find orientation as to how it was going to happen. And that disorientation happened from a SMART goal, which is specific, measurable, aligned, realistic, and timed. And oftentimes organizations don't even address R. They might even change what R means, right? And realistic is always based on your perception. Right? And our perceptions are different depending on how we're seeing things occur, right?
Sure.
So what I do with my clients that are given goals that are unrealistic is I reorient them, first of all. And how do you do that? Well, you help shift their perception about what it is that they're seeing. Right. And it's just like you were talking about stories, right? Stories are based on our personal perspective. And when you change your personal perspective, it opens and expands your way of moving forward. And that's really what my clients are really focused on, is growth and expansion. And when you're focused on growth and expansion, it's much easier to get centered and grounded and feel more self-assured than if you're focused on a goal that feels impossible. It's a total shift.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. And I didn't quite understand it until you talked about shift perceptions, because several years ago, I was working for a company, very, very large corporation, and they were very focused, as many companies in corporate America, on those SMART goals.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a sales manager that was him and his team were crushing it. I mean, they rose to the top of just they were in every category. They were crushing their sales goals. So they rose to the top of the company. They were the peak of success with the amount that they were bringing in. So all the other sales managers wanted to know this guy's secret. So they kept talking to him about, how are you motivating your team? How are you doing this? How are you doing that? And what he said was fascinating. He said, I lowered everyone's quota. I want people to think about this, because we just talked about SMART goals. We had talked about, you had said the R, right? And how everyone's perception on what's realistic is skewed, because your picture of realistic and my picture of realistic might not be in alignment. And everyone was fascinated by that. And they said, well, what do you mean you lowered everyone's quota? And he said, well, they were so frustrated and stressed out about the numbers I was giving them that by lowering their quota, they got so many wins. It goes back to your point about propels motion. Clarity is what propels motion. They had clarity on, instead of focusing on hitting a number, focus on sound business relationships. Go out there, make connections, just hit this number. And they became so addicted by taking that pressure off and hitting goal after goal after goal that his sales within his group skyrocketed. So I think that really speaks to your point about sometimes people, yes, you could focus on SMART goals. I can make a goal about a certain weight that I want to hit, and it could be very, very aligned with SMART goals. I'm never going to hit it. I'm never going to hit it because it's unrealistic, right? And that's what I was doing. So is that speaking to what you had said about the shifting in perspectives?
Yes, and I'll just go one more level. When you have a goal, it's critical, whatever the goal is, to know why. Why is it important? And I took this from when I used to consult to teams where they did a lot of process improvement. And there was a bit in lean, the whys are really important, right? Why are we doing this? But when you have a goal, you go 5 deep. So usually, if you start with the first one, it's usually pretty superficial. Like, oh, I want to wear a size 8 dress, and I want to run a marathon. And they're usually pretty superficial. But when you get deeper, it's, I want to feel better about myself. I want to have more energy. And you get to the core of why you are doing that goal in the first place. And so the goal doesn't drive clarity. It's the 5 whys after the goal that drives clarity. And then when you get to the 5 whys and you actually take a moment and you look at those 5 whys and you see why you're doing it, then you add another component, which is intention. And being intentional is what does the daily practices, right? That's what makes you get up in the morning and do what you need to do with a certain kind of attitude that allows you to have more energy, right? But it didn't start from the goal. It had to be drilled down. And I think that's a little bit of what a lot of CEOs and upper management are running into, is that they're surface. They want to just get it done and get it over with and then move on to the next one. And that's why they get burned out, is because they're just moving through the technical motions, and there's an emotional component that doesn't get addressed, and that becomes the burnout later on.
So are you, just to clarify, are you saying that a lot of times these SMART goals are too surfacey and they're not going deeper within their why?
What I'm saying is that people are not connected to the goal at all because they haven't done the why.
It could be as smart and as regimented. It could be spot on with what their leaders are telling them. But if there's no emotional connection, if there's no why, they may do it, but they're going to be frustrated and stressed out while they're doing it. They're going to get burned out.
Bingo, on the nose, spot on. If you're not connected to the SMART goal, emotionally, energetically, mentally, physically connected to that goal, how do you drive it? You can only do so much with your head and thinking and being strategic, but that doesn't make people move.
Sure. So what would be your recommendation for leaders with their teams, for them, instead of doing SMART goals, to sit down and ask them what they truly want and to go 5 levels deep? Is that what you'd recommend?
No. Because it's personal, right?
Okay.
So, but I would say for a team to get clarity, there needs to be a scheduled point of reflection. You can't just keep moving the machine without having any type of reflection. Reflection is what allows you to say, this is working, this is not working. And I suggest that simple question: what is working? What are we doing that's working? And what are we doing that's not working? And everybody should have something to add to that list, including the leader, because his list is going to be very different than his team's. And his team might say, your micromanagement is not working. And he might not even think, or he or she may not even think that they're micromanaging. So just asking that simple question: what's working? What are we doing that's working? What's not working? That point of reflection is huge, because you can't get from where you are to where you want to go without that. And there's a book title, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. You must be able to adjust. And I think teams need to be more flexible in their adjustment if they want to get more results.
All right, so scheduled point of reflection. So it is the leader simply asking what is working, what isn't working, and then allowing his or her team to dissect what's working, what isn't working.
Yes, or just put it on a list. Let's have awareness about it. Without awareness, you can't make changes.
Sure. So I think there's a perfect segue into something I saw you talk about the other day, which is shadow side. So the shadow aspects of a person that are not seen by others. So when you, in the example that you said about micromanagement, there are leaders that don't recognize that they're even micromanaging. So how can people be, or I guess position themselves, give themselves an opportunity to be more aware with what they're doing regarding their shadow side? What's the best way to think about that?
What's the best way to increase awareness of the shadow? Is that the question?
Yeah, because I feel like there's tons of leaders that, I mean, everyone, not just leaders of people, but leaders of self. Like there are different aspects of our life where we have no idea that we're doing that until someone points it out. And there's a lot of leaders that are they're not allowing for that feedback. So what would you say about positioning leaders to even recognize that they do have these shadows that they're not even seeing themselves?
Well, we all have them, but how we receive the information is key. So being open and willing to hear is where it all begins. And what are you really opening yourself to when you're listening to people share about your leadership? Is an opportunity for growth. And my question to any leaders: are you willing to expand? And if you are, then you absolutely need this information. If you do not have this information, you cannot grow and expand. And if you're going to have an impact within this organization, you must know if you're being perceived as a micromanager, you need a course correction, because that's going to change how you're perceived by your peers as well.
Sure. No, it's well said. There's so many leaders out there, so many CEOs, that if they did the exercise that you had talked about, that personal exercise, going 5 levels deep with their why. So they're asking themselves, why do I want to expand my organization? And then they start getting into, helping their clients. Well, why do they want to help their clients? And they keep going deeper and deeper, realizing that actually they want to have this massive legacy and they want to have generational change and have a massive effect on the community. If they're not willing to be vulnerable and receive feedback from their team, they're not going to win the talent war, because everyone's going to be fleeing from them, right? They're not going to expand their vision. It ties into everything that you just said regarding their why. But I feel like there's such a fear about being vulnerable, because so many people view vulnerability as weakness and they don't see it as a picture of being courageous. And I think once they have that perception, shift, on actually being vulnerable, connecting with people is going to lead to their why, I think that they would see massive growth.
I agree. But let's talk about one of the distractions and disturbances that happen with teams and with leaders is ego. And an imbalance of ego is what will keep you from being able to receive information. And that's huge, because who really wants to know when they're really out of balance? And I'm not talking about a narcissist or super narcissist. I'm just talking about somebody who's taking things personally, right? Well, why do people take things personally? Their ego is involved. Otherwise, you're just receiving information. You still always have a chance to decide what you want to do with the information. You could choose to do nothing, which a lot of people do, or you could choose to I wonder if there's a pattern here. And if you have a chronic pattern of people telling you you're micromanaging and you're not listening, that's something that you probably want to address, because that's going to influence not just your work life, but your personal life too. And if you have children, it's going to influence how your children are being raised, because listening is a key component of emotional intelligence.
Sure. So one of the things that I've seen you talk about is anxiety. And you said anxiety is a lot of times driven because of two factors: inner conflict and trauma.
Yes.
So I appreciate you talking about ego, and everything you said is very valid. But how does that reflect on people's past trauma? So even if someone is what we view as the peak of success, he or she is an amazing business leader, they have a massive team that they are responsible for, could there be past experiences and past traumas that are really detaching their ability to allow for feedback?
Oh, absolutely. That's a trauma of some kind is more likely the cause of somebody's inability to perceive situations properly. So, for example, out of balance, or taking things personally, right? They're taking it and making it about them when it's really not about them. It's about the situation.
Sure.
So trauma is pretty much a touchy topic in corporate, because people like to leave things at the door and come in, you do your job and you leave, and then you can address it. But it's difficult to separate, be congruent and separate things, right? So you probably run into this in your workshops when, people are being vulnerable. What they're doing is becoming congruent, right? In a situation that they probably didn't feel comfortable sharing in the past. And they didn't realize how that situation was influencing their behaviors. Because we don't get to be different people. We put on different hats and we put on different roles, but we're one person. So those inner conflicts of not addressing a trauma will roll into every relationship.
Sure. Well, let's talk about the definition of trauma from a picture perspective, because I feel like a lot of people, they hear the word trauma and they think severe, right? They think like, there's a lot of pictures that trauma brings up, but a lot of people have gone through trauma. And it doesn't need to be this unbelievably life-altering experience. It could be something that positioned people to handle anger in an unhealthy manner. And this happens with leaders all the time, where basically they're in a very stressful moment, and because of different experiences in their past, different traumatic experiences, they're not able to handle that anger, which goes back to emotional intelligence. There's a lot of different things to unpack with that. But let's just talk about trauma for a second. So when you hear trauma, what comes to your mind? What's the picture in your mind when you hear the word trauma?
Perception.
Trauma
is a perception of a situation that occurred. And it doesn't matter if I agree that was traumatic or not traumatic. My belief about your trauma doesn't matter. Your belief about your trauma is what matters. And if you're perceiving you have a traumatic situation, that is unresolved, that is what causes PTSD, for example. And that is what propels inappropriate behavior.
All right, so perception. So someone's perception on a specific experience, and now basically back to the stories that we tell ourselves, they're reliving that experience, the stories that they're telling themselves, which is changing their ability to connect.
Right. So for example, for me, I was bullied by my brother and my sister growing up. Like that wasn't something, I'm in my 50s. That wasn't something that people talked about bullying back then. But in hindsight, in retrospect, looking back, I was bullied by my family. That is not something that, one, people talk about, which is why I made a video series about it. And two, what does that cause? That causes an armoring, get ready, something's going to come at you. And that armor, that protection is a defensive stance that keeps people from getting too close, right? And so how does that play out in the workplace? Well, it's not a coincidence that I went into conflict management. I was used to conflict. That was my comfort zone. I actually saw the beautiful connection that occurs after a conflict. But that wasn't every day in my childhood, but I definitely was used to it. So was my comfort zone. Traumas can be leveraged to make you stronger if you're willing to look at them and understand them and heal them and perceive them differently. And we do that by being heart-based. You cannot heal by being in your mind. So traumas with executives, they're used to strategizing their way through life, right? That's how they got to the top, which, I'm all for strategy. However, the strategy needs to be mind and heart connection. That will diminish inner conflict, and it will allow for a true healing to occur and the changes in relationships to magnify to more harmonic states.
Interesting. So that's not at all where I thought you were going to take it. So which is very intriguing to me. So you were bullied at a young age, and because of that trauma, your perception of that experience, it positioned you to be even better regarding conflict resolution. So you end up going in that. So it's almost like a weakness became a strength for you because that was, you reframed your perception of it. Is that an accurate statement?
100%. But I had to be willing to learn from it and acknowledge what was. It's not an easy thing. First of all, I love my sister and I love my brother. I don't like them. I don't think their behaviors are very healthy. I don't think they're very healthy. And they might say the same about me. But I am here to evolve as a person. And I need to take every part of who I am and embrace it and leverage it to be stronger and to bring better results. Because if I'm incongruent and I'm working with a team that's incongruent, it's a recipe for disaster. If I'm willing to address my own stuff, then the team will be more willing to follow me into the trenches of to get results.
Sure. Wow. All right. So again, a lot to unpack, because even you saying PTSD brings up a lot of images in people's minds where I feel, so you had talked about bullying, where I feel like a lot of times when people think PTSD, they think military, right? They think, a bomb went off somewhere and there's a lot of PTSD, but PTSD can come, these traumatic experiences can come from perceptions that are not being harmonious in our own life. And there's different elements of trauma that we constantly relive because of the stories we're telling ourselves. But was really intriguing is that you really used a weakness to be an incredible strength. And that's what I leaders need to do that. They need to figure out, okay, here's their weakness. What's the perception they have of this weakness? Where did that weakness come from? Is it because of past traumatic experiences? How do they change the perspective to actually utilize that as something that can be their greatest asset, that can be a strength to them. And I've learned this in myself. So I had a very, very skewed view of what success was. So for people listening that are familiar with the Enneagram, I talk about the Enneagram quite frequently. I'm a number 3 with a 4 wing. So I'm a type A, full throttle, very intensive personality. My version of success was so skewed for many, many years, very unhealthy on how I obtained success. Who helped me get over that was actually my wife. My wife is an extremely successful individual, and seeing how she was able to obtain it in a very healthy manner was a huge wake-up call for me. So here I was doing it was, in my opinion, the wrong way, because it was extremely unhealthy. But changing my perception based on what I learned through my wife, now I view success much differently, and I have more of that harmonious aspect in my life. So I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think that is so unbelievably important for leaders to hear.
Well, I think the harmony seems to be a theme in our conversation today. And I think if we're willing to look like where things aren't working, going back to that question to bring to your team, what's working and what's not working, we must be willing to see the whole picture in order to progress. And if we're in denial, which is often what happens with trauma, we deny it and let's just move on and press through, then we cannot leverage it. And we might be leaving one of our biggest strengths on the table, which is our resilience.
Absolutely. No, that's.
But I do want to say one more thing about trauma is what I've seen that's happening with people who are emotionally imbalanced is that they're being put in the victim role, and there's zero power in victimization. So if you think people are doing something to you, that is a perception that needs to be shifted, because you always have a choice. And I think one of my retired captains, senior military officer who then retired and came back and then retired again, in his second retirement, he told me one of the things that he learned from our coaching sessions were that he had a choice. His whole career, they didn't really realize he had a choice in a lot of situations. And we always have choices. I remember distinctly one conversation, he came to me and saying, I have no options here. And I laughed. I was like, what are you talking about? You always have options. I could come up with 3 right off the top of my head. But he could not see them, which is why it's so valuable to work with somebody like me or like you doing workshops, because we need somebody to help us see ourselves more clearly, which is what your wife does. And that's what a reflection does.
Sure. So let's go a little bit further before we close out our time together, because I think when we want to talk about trauma, a lot of people view the last few years as being stuck in a traumatic experience. And you had said about the perception of the experience. A lot of people's perception of what we just went through as a society in the last 2 years have been horrifying. And they're replaying different stories and messages in their mind. So I want you to think about the COVID years and different things that have come because of it. What challenge would you give people regarding the perception of 2020, 2021, 2022, the COVID years? What perception should people focus on to come back stronger and not allow the COVID years to be a major weakness in their life?
Well, I would challenge people to look at the opportunities that have been presented, whether you're seeing a challenge as a challenge and an issue or an opportunity. And I think that distinction in and of itself will shift your perception. So that's number one. And I would say coming from a place of caring over competition will get you further faster than going into a place of limitation. So COVID really was an opportunity for many people to pause, to reflect, to regroup, reset, and start again. But behaviors have a habit of coming back if we don't make a distinct decision to do things differently. And I think that's what COVID really provided an opportunity for people to really rethink how they're doing their work. Even remote work and coming into the office, work hours, all of those things need to be readdressed in a new paradigm, in a new way of doing business, because that's what we're being presented with daily, is we must be more resilient and better at what we're doing. And we can't do that if we're fragmented and if we're separate in the way that we're thinking.
Sure. Yeah, you bring up a fantastic point. I immediately think of my grandmother. My grandmother was the most empathetic human being I've ever met in my life. My grandmother had an ability to connect with people on such an incredible level. And it didn't matter if the person was the CEO of a company or if they were an intern of a company. I mean, man, could she connect. And a huge part of that was because of what she went through during the Great Depression. And she never focused on the horrors of that era. She only focused on the opportunities and how that positioned her. She experienced so much pain that pain propelled her to be empathetic. So my challenge to everyone listening is we just went through a very strange time in human history. How terrible would it be is if we focus on the negative perception of what happened and not allow different things that happened to be part of our greatest strength. And going back to your point about the different opportunities that have come up because of that have been things that we never even thought were possible are happening. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. All right, so to close out, there's so much that I got from our conversation. I have three main takeaways that I really want to focus on personally. And that is clarity is what propels motion. I think you really challenged people's thoughts and perceptions on SMART goals, really focusing on the why, not the surfacey level SMART goals. So I think that was a huge takeaway. Another takeaway is the scheduled point of reflections. It's simple. I don't want people to confuse simple with easy. I think it's simple, but I think it's going to take work on on leaders' parts. But I think that it's so powerful what you said, scheduled point of reflection, just asking individuals, teams, what's working, what isn't working, and then allowing them to share with that leader what's working and what's not working, so that they can understand that there could be a different shadow that they have. They may not recognize something's happening without asking. And then my biggest takeaway, the third point, was regarding trauma. And I really appreciate you saying about the perception of the experience, because a lot of times that word can be so profound. There's so many different images that come up when we think trauma, but I really appreciate you just saying it's the perception of our experience, because we can take a perception that we view as our greatest weakness and actually figure out a way to make it our greatest strength. So I appreciate that. Those are my three big takeaways. And there's numerous takeaways I'm sure a lot of people will get, but I appreciate those three. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome. I'm so happy that worked for you. One tip about the what's working, what's not working is to be clear about, are you talking about what's working with our team, or are you talking about what's working with your leadership? Those are two different questions. And so if the leader's making it about them, it's going to be about them. If it's making it about the team, it's going to be about the team. So the clarity in that question is huge.
That's a very important point. No, I appreciate you mentioning that. This is very important. So where's ways that people can find you? If individuals listen to this, they want to get more, they want coaching from you, what's the best place that they can connect with you?
The best place to reach me, and they can get to all my links, is from KIANNA.com, KIANNAA. And Kianna, I have my corporate links there because I do all kinds of team development and coursework. I've taken my clients out to the farm and teach nonverbal communication, because all communication, and I'm sure you touch on this, 90% of it is nonverbal. So it really is how we're feeling, how we're expressing what we're feeling, that I focus on with my clients. So they can get to me at kianna.com, and I have lots of free resources as well.
Okay, fantastic. What I'll do to make it extremely convenient for people, I'll put links in the show notes. People can just click, go right to your site. I'll even include your LinkedIn account. People can connect and follow your content. So thanks again for your time. I know you're extremely busy. I very much value your time. There was so much that I personally got from it, and I'm positive that listeners got a lot as well. So thank you again.
Thank you. My honor.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you have a story that you would like to share, feel free to drop an email to matt@mattzaun.com with the subject line Stories with Traction. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tons of resources on how you can be a better storyteller. Remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.